Welcome to another Realtio community show. This will be the last show of the year. So, um, we have one or two that will be popping up here in January, or probably more than that. But until then, this is the last one for the year. So this particular show is on triggering automated workflows through Realtio Integration Hub to drive governance processes. So Dan Gage is kind of our guru on all things workflows, it seems. So he's back again to do some more stuff around it. So I'm really excited about this one. And from some of the RSVPs, it seems like you are as well. The way we're going to do this today is one, as usual, keep yourself on mute. All questions should be asked in chat, or feel free to take yourself off mute and ask. The show is going to be recorded and recording now, and it will be posted to the Realtio community. Just the way the format, though, is going to work today is we will go into a presentation for about 7 or 8 slides. Dan will do a demo, and then he's going to show you how to do some of this stuff yourself. He's going to provide all of that information. And then we will take questions if we have time, but we've promised to do an Ask Me Anything on this particular topic if we don't get to all of the questions today. So really appreciate that, Dan. So upcoming is today's show and last show of the year, triggering automated workflows through Realtio Integration Hub to drive governance processes. We do have an instructor-led training on January 9th. If you're interested in that, just go to the events on community.realtio.com and the upcoming events, and you can see some of that. But then we also have a show on January 10th, and it will be another Realtio Integration Hub, some RDM utilities. That one should be very interesting. And then if you didn't know, and I'll push this into the chat here shortly, we have started a podcast called Data Driven Podcast. We have 4 episodes on there if you like to listen to kind of strategy type thought leadership, data stories, data kind of focus areas. This is the place to go. Really excited about that. And then lastly, your opinions do matter. If you are a customer, please rate and review us at Gartner Peer Insights. Dan, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you.
Thanks. All right. Can you confirm that you can see my opening slide?
Confirmed. Yep.
All right, great. So, just 2 slides just to remind everybody kind of the purpose of Realtio, which I think is going to tie into what we're going to be covering today. And, obviously Realtio is intended to be able to consume data from across your enterprise into a single source. We can work interactively with those applications, as well as your 3 primary clouds, and as well as even, the IBM cloud, the Oracle cloud, other clouds as well. So Realtio is really designed to be an part of your enterprise data fabric. You've likely seen this slide referring to the Realtio Velocity Packs, which is kind of our new movement towards pre-built solutions and pre-built data models. The core capabilities there in the center are not new. There are things that have definitely been part of the Realtio platform, have continued to grow and evolve. And what I've highlighted here in red, really the data quality, data governance, and data integration components is what I'm going to be focusing on here today, is really bringing these 3 capability areas and tying them together through the Realtio Integration Hub to provide automation around, in this case, recognizing data anomalies and automating the governance of those. So what we're going to look at doing is step 1 is going to be really defining a trigger condition. So detecting, when something is wrong with your data. It could be a match that was detected that is not an auto match, but is of a high enough confidence rate. If you want to go that route, you can use the data validation framework. You can use the out-of-the-box cleansers. There's a variety of different ways in which you may trigger this process to begin. For our example today, we'll be utilizing the data validation framework. The idea then is that you have a workflow that you want to target towards execution during that process. And then likewise, the ability to have a Realtio Integration Hub process that is going to effectively look for that condition and then launch that workflow. And then, of course, once that workflow is launched, being able to interact with it and do the actual governance process. So interacting with those workflows, of course, we have the relative inbox. You'll also receive an email notification as well as having that annotation directly on the profile itself. And we'll see examples of those here shortly. So in our scenario here, we're going to start with, and there will be a live demonstration here shortly, so I'm just kind of overviewing what we're going to see. In the individual entity type in the relative data modeler, I went into the validation functions. We refer to these as the data validation functions. And I'm creating a new validation here, and I'm just going to look where last name, and you see here in the middle, it's simply using a simple expression to say last name is missing. So if you create a profile and there's no last name, it's simply going to annotate the record with metadata that reflects the fact that this record has been created and it has violated this constraint. So this is our triggering event that we're going to look for. So then we want to build a workflow that notifies a business user that they need to interact with this record and take some remediating action. So we're going to build a very simple workflow here. In this case, it's literally just going to be a one-step workflow. Now, we are going to put two options on the form to say that it was resolved or that it was rejected. In the case of our demonstration here, and I do focus on the fact that this is demonstration for educational purposes only, having both the resolved and the rejected take no different action is probably not a legitimate business use case. But we wanted to kind of highlight the ability to make different decisions and to have different routing paths. And then we'll, as a follow-up to this session, there is a second workflow that I will share with you that includes additional routing based upon the decisions that are made in previous steps. So we'll see examples of that. One thing I do want to emphasize for anybody that looks to build and recreate this scenario, if you're going to be utilizing the Reltio workflow modeler, in order to participate in a Reltio workflow, you do need to have role workflow assigned to you. In order to create and publish workflows, you do need to have role workflow manager assigned to the user credentials that you'll be logging in to the Reltio modeler framework. So being tenant admin is not enough to interact with workflows or to create and publish workflows. But if you are a tenant admin, you can assign yourself these roles in your dev environment to be able to work through these scenarios. So the next step is to be able to utilize the Reltio Integration Hub. And here on the right-hand side is a finished Reltio integration process that's going to look for that event, trigger the workflow, and then we've just got a little bit of error handling in here as well that we'll talk about time permitting at the end of this session. But again, in order to use the Reltio Integration Hub, you do have a required role, and that is Role Integration Specialist. Again, being tenant admin is not enough to be able to access the Reltio Integration Hub. But if you are tenant admin, you can assign yourself the Role Integration Specialist so that you can use the Reltio Integration Hub product. All right. So in our scenario, again, we're going to go right into the demo. The idea is we're going to create a new profile that violates a constraint. In this case, it's violating multiple constraints, but the constraint we're focusing on is missing last name. We're going to have a Reltio Integration Hub process that's going to go out and look for records, and it's going to trigger that workflow notification. And again, we're going to walk through the steps on, in this case, we're going to enable email notification as well. That is an optional step within the workflow, but we are definitely going to highlight in very meticulous detail all the steps that you'll need to do all the appropriate best practices in creating and automating these workflows. So let's jump into the demo. So I'm going to start off in the Reltio dashboard here. And one of the best ways to look for data quality validations is in the data quality dashboard for the entity type of your interest. So here at the bottom of the screen, I have my data validation rules, and you'll see that there's a number of rules in here. And the one that I'm interested in is this one at the bottom, last name is missing. And you'll see there's currently one profile in the system that's missing the last name. So if I go in just for demonstration purposes and create a new record without a last name and simply save it, you'll see that missing last name is being recognized on that record. And just to highlight that, going into the Reltio data modeler, going into the individual entity type and the validation functions, you'll see here in the middle is the last name is missing rule that I've created. And going into this rule, and again, in the slides, you'll see, and Chris will make it available for you to download these through the community. The slides that we're going to be covering here shortly include screenshots of walking through and actually recreating this validation rule and the workflows that we're going to see here. But in this case, it's a very simple rule. Last name is missing, and that's why this record has been annotated with that detail. It's also missing the email. But what we can also do is we can go back into our data quality dashboard, and we'll now see that last name is missing. If we drill into that, we'll see my new test record is now being found via this search for the last name is missing data validation function. So what I'm showing you right now is just a manual way of identifying records that have triggered this data quality validation. So the data validation can be defined through the Reltio data modeler. Once you have done so, as soon as a record is created, either through the Reltio interface, brought in through the Reltio data loader, or even a third-party integration solution, once it lands into the Reltio platform, we are going to execute those data validation rules and annotate those records. So in this case, we're going to be able to identify when that record has been violated that rule, and we're going to want to trigger a workflow. So by going into the Reltio console, into the workflow modeler, we have a recent enhancement now that Reltio now makes it visible for you to see any workflows that have been deployed on that environment already. And you can simply click and drill into them. So go ahead, this is the workflow that we're going to walk through in the steps that you'll have access to from start to finish, starting with creating a brand new workflow, getting that workflow, assigning it to role workflow. In this case, I'm using the one role that I know would be required in order to have access to workflow. So in your environment, you would likely want to assign this to a role data steward or a role of users who are appropriate to remediate the violation or the triggering event that has started this. So that's an important step. But we're also going to walk through all the steps to be able to set up the form, which are the options that become available to the user. The validator is really just a necessary part of Reltio to be able to receive that data and confirm that it's coming into the workflow correctly. But there's also a notification on assignment and notification on completion that I've documented in here. And that's what's going to send that email notification if the default value is true when those tasks take place. And then finally, there is the listener class. And again, these are just the helper classes that the Reltio framework uses to execute these tasks. Now, I do highlight in the documentation here that we'll include with the course here that these Java classes can be customized. So the task assignment, by default, it's going to use the role assigned here, which was role workflow. It's going to use a round robin assignment to anybody that has role workflow assigned to them. But if you need to customize the way you assign it, you can go in and inherit from this Reltio Java class and then simply extend the assignment logic. So that is definitely a customization. It's not something that a lot of our customers do, but it is well documented. And I'll provide links to that area where you need to. So by default, we're just going to be using the default round robin assignment to users that are members of role workflow. And they're going to be presented with two options. Those two options are going to come from this decision form variable, and they will be to indicate that the problem was resolved or I reject this workflow. So now that this workflow is there, you would simply click slave and it would deploy it and make it available to the end users. And one other thing to focus on, if you click just in the background here, if you click on nothing, you'll see the general properties for the whole workflow. In this ID for this workflow, this identifier here, just the word review in all lower cases. This is an important step here because this is what's going to be used to invoke this workflow from the Reltio Integration Hub. So by going into the Reltio Integration Hub, I have two versions of this workflow. We're going to be focusing on the workflow automation one, which is the simpler version that I walk you through the creation. In this case, I'm triggering on a specific schedule, and I document that I tend to use this methodology when testing and building initial workflows and initial Reltio Integration Hub processes because it's the easiest to test and debug. In a production environment, you would much more likely want to listen to the Reltio event queue, and we can touch on that time permitting or cover that in an Ask Me Anything session. But we're simply going to execute at an interval schedule, and today I'm just going to edit and test this recipe when I'm ready. It's going to go into the Reltio connector here. And you see that I have a filter condition here that's looking for records that have violated the missing last name rule and are of the individual entity type. So it's simply just going to do a search for any records who have found that they have violated that rule. It's going to bring back the URI for those records. Using the for each, we're going to iterate through each of those records, and you'll see that the records coming back from step 2 is the data pill that we're going to iterate through. And for each of those records, we're going to invoke the Reltio workflow API. And again, we have all this is going to be documented and detailed in the following slides. That is going to trigger this process. So if I simply hit test recipe, it's going to go out and it's going to execute this process. So this is something that you would have running continuously in the background, either running on an interval schedule where it's looking for those events, or subscribing to the Reltio event queue and taking action on a more prescribed notion when necessary. So you can see here, if we look at the search in the output, we'll see that it did find 2 entities, and those are going to be the 2 entities that were identified here through the search UI ending in 9G and V1. So going back in, we can see that the 9G and the V1 were in fact the entities that were found. And for each of those entities, it created a workflow instance. So if we go back and drill into either one of these records, we'll now see in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see I have a red workflow notification that has now appeared on this record, telling me that the review workflow has been instantiated. And because we assigned this to role workflow, anybody on this tenant who has role workflow is a potential candidate. So for demonstration purposes and for your own purposes, you may choose to just reassign it to yourself, and then you'll be able to now choose from those 4 options that were defined in that workflow. So if I choose that it's resolved,
Hey, quickly, Dan,
sure.
is that an internal event queue that you're working in, or?
Yeah, so for
Okay.
demonstration purposes here, I'm not using an internal event queue. I'm simply doing a search on a periodic basis for records that have violated this constraint, which in this case, I definitely want to acknowledge that until this situation is remediated, in this case, I actually resolved that workflow without remediating this rule. So if I come back in here and I run that recipe again, what we're going to see is it is going to trigger that workflow again. And again, it takes a sec for it to show up. So what we would typically advocate as a best practice is coming in and building your Reltio automation recipe to start with a monitor for the Reltio queue triggered from an app. And we would recommend triggering it from the Reltio queues. So the SQS would be a more effective way of saying that we're only going to trigger this process for events that are sent to the queue. And of course, if you're using the Azure Service Bus or the Google Pub Sub, you could start with that as well. But that's the process that we would typically recommend for a production implementation, because our goal here today was to just focus on educational purposes on how to look for the trigger event and then how to launch the workflow and build the workflow itself.
So was that the internal queue that you're suggesting we use? It's
Yeah.
not the external queue.
No, I'm sorry. I would recommend the external queue. Yes.
Okay.
So the internal queues are not accessible outside of Reltio. The internal queues are going to be used for things like indexing and match evaluation.
Okay.
So if you're going to use that external queue, you would want to go into the Reltio tenant management. And then you'll have your external queue definitions here. And I do have an external queue. You see that my streaming is currently turned off. But if I did enable this, I would have the name of the queue here that I would be connecting to inside the Reltio Integration Hub to listen for these events. So again, I think we've got another session where we may have walked through that, but we can certainly cover that in a follow-up session, or we can create another short video to post to the community. All right, so what I wanted to focus on now is really the idea of, what did it take for me to build this demo. So what I've done here, and I'm actually going to put it into just a slide sorter mode, you can see that there is a very detailed number of screenshots that I've included here with callouts that I'm going to walk you step by step through everything that's needed, that if you start in a fresh Reltio dev environment and you want to recreate this demo scenario, these are all the steps that are necessary. And I'm not going to go through every detail, but I'll walk through the slides here that you're going to be creating a data validation rule or determining what's going to be your triggering event. You'll need to create the workflow that's going to be triggered. You'll need to build out the Reltio Integration Hub recipe that will trigger that workflow when records recognized as violating that trigger condition. We'll then see that you create the profile in the Reltio rule, user interface, which violates the rule. In this case, we manually ran the recipe, but in a production environment, you would have that recipe either listening to the queue or just running at a periodic basis. And then you would be able to see that workflow and see the workflow notifications coming in via email, as well as through the inbox and other tasks. So I'll walk through here, going into the validation functions, using the create new feature, defining the rule. And I suggest just if you're getting started and you don't have a lot of experience with the data validation hub, just choose any field you want and choose it as missing. And then if you create a record with that field missing, it will trigger that response automatically. And I think we've got some questions here.
I can ask them. Let me know if you want me to ask them now, or do you want to wait?
Yeah, I'll open it up to the audience. I don't know if we want to, these slides are here. And like I said, I spent a painstaking amount of detail to kind of go in here and show you creating a workflow from scratch and literally dragging in the end component, dragging in the exclusive gateway, dragging in the task. What are the steps to actually connect them together and building out that workflow step by step? So I certainly want to encourage everybody to ask questions through the community. So we could certainly open it up to Q&A now to ask questions about what's capable, but I encourage everybody to try and walk through these slides and try and recreate it in your own environment. If you have any questions around alternative options, then feel free to post them in the community and we can kind of open it up.
So one is, before we do, is I'll make sure that these are posted on community, but then I'll send a follow-up email to everyone that's on this call, and the team, and you guys can send that over to whoever you think might benefit from it. So first question, is there a plan to have possibility to assign to specific roles the DCR without need for doing the Java customization?
Yeah, I've definitely talked to product management about that. They're aware of this request from customers. So currently it's not on the roadmap that I'm aware of, but it's definitely something that our product management team looks for our customers to submit those requests via the AHA Ideas portal. So for any of you that are registered Reltio consultants or Reltio customers, you can definitely get to the AHA portal through the Reltio community. And I would strongly encourage you, for any of you that want to have enhancement requests, such as the ability to have separate data change requests by entity type, if you submit that as a request through the AHA portal, the more the Reltio product management team sees that request from our customers and our consultants, the more priority is going to be given to implementing that in a sooner approach. So I definitely would encourage everybody to share that or any other feature requested.
And I'll add on to that, Dan, is if you create that, then go to community and let folks know that you created this and let them know what that is with the link. And I've seen people go in and vote or say, voted, so, just encourage your peers to vote as well.
Yes.
Can we create any customized pop-up message in MDM UI during the execution of the workflow?
So no, there's not going to be a pop-up. You do have the ability that while a workflow is being executed, if I switch over to the other record that has an active workflow, you can add comments down here. Typing very poorly today. So you can add comments that are going to be visible. So in this case, because this workflow is currently assigned to Ashley, Ashley's going to get a notification that I've added this comment. You, of course, also have the ability to annotate anything in Reltio with our collaborative process here. So you can collaborate on those data validations. So here in this case, I can say, plus Ashley, you know, I started a workflow for you. And Ashley's going to get another notification from the Reltio system inviting her to participate in this. You see here the collaboration chat that has now been started on that data validation. So there's a number of different ways to collaborate, but there's not any proactive way of popping up data other than just calling the APIs or having these messages or collaborations or annotating the record with additional data.
Hey, Dan, you could, in addition to showing the annotation there, you could pop that message up into the header with the UI configuration, I believe.
Interesting. Okay.
You know,
So,
you know, where you can do the execution of that, or show that message in a warning message at the top.
The data validations, absolutely, absolutely. So what Steve is saying is that where the attribute validations here are annotated as data within the record, through configuration, you can tell Reltio that when a data validation rule has been violated, it'll expose a yellow box here in the header, and it'll specifically call out any of the rules and draw greater attention to them. So that's a great point, Steve.
So there was a comment, and I'm not sure if you can do this, but show the mapping in detail that creates a payload and process type. I don't know if that's.
Yep, I can definitely do that. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you in the documentation here where in the Reltio Integration Hub, I walk you through the process here of when you're going to invoke the automated workflow. I choose an action to call Reltio, and then I'm going to use the guided setup. And then here's the path. And what I did for demonstration purposes is because these are screenshots, I actually put that text of which you can copy and paste into these callouts so that when Chris shares this with you as a PDF, you'll still be able to copy and paste these details on how you make that call within Reltio. So in this case, we're using a custom action because Reltio doesn't have an action to automatically trigger a workflow. So by using the custom action, and we need to use the fully qualified path to the Reltio workflow engine, you do need to set a header parameter. So I walk you through how to enable the request header parameters. And then that payload here, and here's the example payload that you would ingest into the import schema for the request body. And then the one thing that I do highlight is when you're passing that URI, it is expecting it to be an array. So you need to manually add square brackets. So I do call that out here that you're going to want to add these square brackets around the URI when it's invoking that workflow, because the idea is that the Reltio workflow engine is designed that you could pass multiple URIs in at the same time. So if we go into that process and look at it here, you can see where we've mapped the URI coming in, and I've put the square brackets around it here manually to indicate that it's an array. Now, you could use this as a data pill, and you could iterate and create multiple workflows at the same time. That would just be an alternate version of this recipe. I started with a very simplified version, which for those of you who have the need, this does utilize what are called Reltio tasks that are allocated to you as part of your standard entitlement. So you do want to be aware of the task utilization. You do have a monthly quota. The vast majority of Reltio customers do not utilize their monthly quota of APIs and tasks. So being able to create this recipe to do this, especially in your dev environment, is a very viable approach. But doing optimizations where you pass multiple records to a single API. In this case, when we're looping through these records, we are looping through, you'll see there's an option here. We're treating them one at a time, as opposed to treating them in sets of 100 records at a time, which is certainly a viable way to process these. It would just require a different level of expertise within the Reltio Integration Hub to do more batch processing. So,
Great. How many API calls will be invoked with this Reltio Integration Hub recipe? If there are many records with this validation, then then the number of tasks will be huge. So asking this because is there a limitation? I think you might have just covered that actually.
Yeah, exactly. So you do want to be aware of the fact. So the search API call here is going to count as a single task. You do have the ability down here to set the max number of records that are returned. And again, because this process is doing a search, and as the participant indicated, it could potentially find, if you had tens of thousands of records that were violating this rule, then iterating through all of them would not be effective way of handling it. That's where coming in through the Veltio event queue would be a much more effective way. That if there were 10,000 records that violated this rule, only subscribing to the events and checking when records were created or updated and checking to see if they violated that rule would be a more effective way of minimizing that task utilization.
Thank you. Should all workflow automation now go through Reltio Integration Hub going forward, or is this a specific to validation rule constraints workflow automation?
No, I think Reltio is definitely leaning towards encouraging customers to use the Reltio Integration Hub to automate tasks that are not automatically automated within Reltio. So an example of that is traditionally you would use lifecycle actions to perform many actions after save or before save. And those LCAs had to be coded in Java, or at least put into a Lambda function and mapped into your Reltio environment. So they were more technical and more tedious to maintain. By subscribing to the event queues and using Reltio Integration Hub to asynchronously respond to those event processes is definitely the method that we're encouraging customers to use. Whether you're subscribing to those events with a Lambda function, whether you're subscribing to those events with your own third-party integration tool, the Reltio Integration Hub is it's a technology that we provide to you that lets you automate these processes of responding to those event queues. But we're definitely seeing a trend in the industry of customers moving towards more real-time reactions to data quality anomalies and the ability to have governance workflows and syndication of data. So that more real time is going to be responding to those event queues. And how you respond to those events, whether it's through the Reltio Integration Hub or through another third-party technology subscribing to those, we definitely see that pattern becoming the predominant methodology.
Great. We do have some more questions. So, and before you guys go, make sure you we have a survey at the end. So when you leave, please take that survey. That'd be extremely helpful. So can an event be set so it generates for a validation function?
Yeah, there is currently not an event for data validation function. So there's an entity created and an entity changed. I have discussed with product management having a data validation rule violation event being put into the list of options that you could subscribe just to the creation or violation of data validation rules. And that's why primarily I had started this process with doing this search on your analytical attributes where the attribute validation function is a specific rule. And therefore, as those records get remediated, in this case, I didn't actually remediate this one. So what I would do is come in here and add a last name field. So you see the missing last name attribute validation. When I save that, that rule is no longer violated. So I can now come into my workflow and I'll save Ashley the time by indicating that I have resolved this issue. And next time that process runs, it will no longer find this record, because even though it's violating other validations, it's no longer violating the one that we specifically were looking for.
Great. Can the workflow be triggered by an application other than Reltio Integration Hub?
So the answer to that is absolutely yes. The issue is your Reltio Integration Hub is just starting this workflow via a Reltio API call. By making that API call through the Reltio Integration Hub, Reltio is going to simplify the creation of the authentication tokens. But this is definitely something that I have done through Postman. So here you can see I just have that same workflow in here. Because I'm part of the sales organization, I use a different workflow server Most of you would be using the prod instance of our workflow server, and then having that body. Here's an example where two different workflows are being created. In this case, it's potential match review between these two records. But yeah, being able to invoke it through Postman, through a Java code, through a third-party integration tool like a TIBCO or Del Boomi, are all fully supported in common practices.
Great. And then Gary's been kind enough to answer some of these questions. So if there's additional questions on his answers, please let us know. One question is, can we have this PowerPoint? Yes, it's going to be posted to the community, and I'll be sending out an email tomorrow.
Yeah, and one of the things that I also asked Chris to do is these workflows themselves. So I do have this one-step workflow here, and then I did mention that I created a more complex two-step workflow here, where I simply took that same process, and for the resolved option, I've added in a manager approval and basically just duplicated the same process that I used to create the review step. And in this case, the decisions are approve and reject, whereas the initial decisions are resolve or reject. So in this case, if the manager rejects it, you'll see that I send it back to the reviewer. If the manager approves it, then it does end the workflow. So Chris will be sharing with you download links to access both of these workflows. So you can certainly go through the slides that will be provided and create the workflow from scratch, but you would also be able to just go out and say, I want to open and go out, and I should have it here someplace in my Reltio downloads folder. So when you get that file from Chris, you would be able to just import that pre-built workflow right into your environment. And then again, I mentioned that I'm using role workflow as the assignment and role workflow manager. As the manager workflow, you would want to tweak those to your preferred environments, but anybody on this event, in order to create this, you should have both role workflow and role workflow manager. So it should work for you out of the box if you need.
Great. Can you use this for an enrichment to populate an attribute with values from another source?
So you definitely can, but in that case, if you're doing it in the Reltio workflow engine, what you would need to do is add an additional step. So in this case, you can bring in an additional step. And if you set that as what's called a service task, right here, a service task, you would associate that with some Java code. And you'll see here that I can just insert that as an interim step so that after the first reviewer, so let's say you wanted to check and see if the reviewer had actually resolved that. And you would only need to do that if it was in this section, because if the reviewer had rejected it, it wouldn't matter whether they had made the change. But if they claimed that they resolved it, but they hadn't actually resolved it, and you wanted to write some code to check and see, has it been resolved? And if so, to annotate the record with a comment or with some additional details, that can be done through a service task that would be defined, and you would create a listener to invoke that Java class, and you would just insert it here. So in the slides, back in the workflow documentation, I do provide details right here. The customization process is documented right here. So in the Reltio public documentation, we do provide details on how you can create that custom service task. So if you want some functionality to be customized to occur at some step during the Reltio workflow process, you can do it here. If you want some custom code to be executed as part of the Reltio integration hub, then simply by being in edit mode and adding a step in here, your step could be to, you could execute some Python code if you wanted to bring some Python code into here. If you wanted to call out to an external Java service that was either in REST or SOAP, there are connectors within Reltio Integration Hub to call out to your own external code. There is a Python, there's a JavaScript component. So if you have a different, whatever your preferred ways of putting custom logic into this process would be, Reltio can work with.
Great. Can we implement something similar for validating the attributes and notify in relationships?
So yes, Reltio has recently added the ability to create data validation rules on the relationships themselves. So you can create, and that's going to be in your tenant management. So you saw that when I created that data validation rule, I did so by going into the entity type. Reltio now supports the ability at the relationship type. So if I wanted to create a friend relationship, if you edit that relationship types, you have to click and drill into it. But you see, you now have validation functions here. So the ability to create a validation function on a relationship attribute is something we've newly added. So in this case, the only options are the start and end dates of the option, and then whether there's commenters. So if you wanted to set a policy where all relationships should have a start date or end date, so if you were to say if start date is missing, you want to notify the user that they forgot to enter a start date, and then have Reltio Integration Hub send a workflow to them to go back and fix that record to add that start date into the system. You can now create these validation functions on relationship attributes. And the only thing to be aware of is that those data validations are not going to appear with your entity data validations. They will appear in the relationship facet.
Yeah,
So
this is Chandra, Dan. That's exactly why I asked that question. So we have a requirement where we have some attributes that are stored at the relationship level, and we need a validation, and we added that. But however, when I bring that as a reference attribute on the profile page, the validation message or the warning doesn't appear there.
That is correct. So as of today, and this is a great opportunity for you to submit an enhancement request to the Reltio product management team. So that information will be in the payload of the record, that if you request that relationship, you will see that data there. But the only place that we actually visualize it in the standard Reltio user interface is on the relationship facet itself.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. We'll follow up with
the ability to, yeah, you would have the ability to do something with Reltio Integration Hub to trigger some kind of notification or to otherwise notify a user that that it had been done.
Yeah, I think I think we got to look into that option. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
So can we, this is answered already, but can we connect a zero event hub streaming from Reltio? And it says it is for either inbound and outbound. I don't know if there's additional insights there.
I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm not
Can
sure.
we connect a zero event? Hold up.
Yeah.
Hub streaming from Reltio.
Yes, correct. So in the Reltio tenant management, in the external queues, even if your Reltio deployment is currently on AWS or Google, you can still go in and add a queue, and you can add a Reltio Azure queue, the Azure Service Bus, as a destination for Reltio events. So if you have Reltio push the events, now in this case, if you're deployed on Google or AWS, you would probably need to provision that queue yourself, or you could talk to your Reltio customer success manager and see if Reltio could provide that. There may be a small fee associated with it, but if you provision that queue yourself and just configured the Reltio environment to push events to your queue, using the Reltio Integration Hub, I can create a recipe here that looks for events from the Azure Service Bus. And you'll see that, it's going to require me to put in the credentials first. So each connector is going to work a little bit differently. But once you connect to that Azure Service Bus, the events coming from it will just automatically get streamed into the Reltio Integration Hub. So you could build this recipe, have this recipe just running continuously as a platform component. And as events were recognized in that bus. So if the bus was something that was already provisioned inside your environment and you had other applications writing to it, and you wanted to pick up those events and push them into Reltio, you could use this exact same process here where you would just subscribe to that bus, get the events, and then when you receive those events, you could call the Reltio system and update a record in Reltio with any data that was coming inbound from that bus. So outbound to the bus would just require you to configure Reltio to utilize the Azure Service Bus as a queue destination. To consume incoming events, you would just subscribe to the Azure Service Bus and then take the appropriate action inside of Reltio.
Right. Krishna says, hey, thanks so much for walking us through a demo. Can you show how to trigger the recipe in regular intervals without an external trigger such as SQS or PubSub?
Yeah, so the way that I had defined this originally was going to do exactly that. So notice that the one that we created was the workflow automation. I also exported, and you'll have the ability to import one that I've got is a little bit more thoroughly developed. So it's using a try-catch monitor here. You can see the monitor and on error. So it's looking for those. So here, because these guys are being triggered on a specific schedule, you can see that it's running every 5 minutes. So if I just started this recipe right now, every 5 minutes, this process would wake up, look for records in Reltio. If it found them, it would execute this and start workflows for them. But what I do point out in the slides down here at the very bottom, if you execute that process more than once, if a workflow already exists and you try and create another instance of the same workflow for an existing record, the API will return an error indicating that the task already exists. So that's why I definitely recommended using the error handling capabilities of the Reltio Integration Hub to catch when Reltio returns an error that task already exists. Now, if you're trying to create a workflow task and it already exists, meaning that you didn't need to create it in the first place, then obviously you're still utilizing Reltio Integration Hub tasks to perform that action. So by subscribing to an event-based queue or validating whether or not the workflow already exists, and that can be done as part of your filter. Matter of fact, it probably would have been a more effective way to do that. If we look in here, I have a saved search for open workflows. So using the Reltio Search API, you can actually search where workflow, and that's just an option in your search screen, where workflow exists. And right now you can see I have 13 records where there's actually a workflow currently assigned to this record. And these are probably match review workflows. Well, not sure why, but it could be a closed workflow. You may need to look at the workflow task. Yeah, workflow, the step. I think you need to look for the step actually exists. Yeah, so here you see I only get one active workflow. So instead of saying the workflow exists, because workflow exists is still going to find records where the workflow is closed. So where you say step exists, this is only going to give you records that have an active workflow. So if I come back in here, this is already assigned to myself. So if I just reject this and make it go away, because that workflow has now been closed, if I refresh this screen, it'll take a second for the indexer to catch up there. But I should no longer be seeing Gene here. Like I said, once the indexer catches up. So workflow is a separate service. So it may take a few seconds for that service detail to get into the index. But when it does, this would definitely filter that out. So one way to potentially enhance this is when you do the initial search up here and you say, I'm looking for individuals. In this case, I did attribute validation count is greater than 0. I can also do and workflow.step, exists. So this is probably not the right syntax. We can follow up on that. If somebody's interested in this, if you post a message to the community, I'll make sure that I get the proper syntax for you. And this would definitely be a more effective way of making sure that you're only creating new tasks for records that have the appropriate violation and do not already have a workflow active.
Great. Just a couple more questions. Can we make certain fields mandatory for successful triggering or submission of the workflow? So if you are doing an update which needs to be live on a specific date, then change effective date is mandatory attribute to be filled. Is that possible?
So yeah, I think that that could definitely be done a couple different ways. So you would start by going into your relative data modeler and defining the attribute to indicate the condition. So I've definitely seen customers where they're looking at like the status of a customer, and if a customer is just a prospect, they don't do workflow notifications and they don't do governance on prospects. But when somebody becomes a customer, then the type, the value of the customer type field or the profile type, when it's customer, they take some action. You can have a field that says, do I want to start workflows, yes or no? And whatever those criteria are, if you simply just add them into your filter criteria here, so that you're only considering starting workflows for records that meet that criteria, whether it's attributes having specific values or whatever your criteria are, you can simply just add that to the filter and it'll minimize the number of records that are being processed or considered for that triggering event. And that's why we kind of, in the slides here, focused here at the very beginning is what is your triggering condition? So we started with the very simplest triggering condition is just the fact that a data validation rule has been identified. And then as through this session, we have identified the fact that if a workflow already exists, we would want to change our trigger condition. So the trigger condition is now if the data validation rule is violated and a workflow does not exist. And if you wanted to also have an additional criteria that says, and some other attribute has a specific value or a start date field is within a week, something of that nature, you would just add that into your triggering condition. And then the rest of the process would just be based upon your business requirements.
Is it possible to provide access to Integration Hub for a training tenant? So currently their tenant is showing up, you don't have access to this. Can they do a support ticket or something or?
That's a great question. I don't know. So if you're using the Reltio test drive, I don't know if Steve is still out there. Steve's a little bit more familiar with the test drive than I am. I don't know if Reltio Integration Hub is included with test drive, but it's definitely something if you talk to your Reltio customer success manager or the Reltio training team, they may provide that. Because we do offer very thorough training on the Reltio Integration Hub. And well, obviously to support that, the training team would need to provide you access to that. So you can also reach out directly to the training department.
Thank you. So I think that's all the questions. Anything else to add, Dan? I mean, this is pretty in depth.
Yeah, no, like I said, this is obviously an area that I'm fairly knowledgeable about and very passionate about. There's clearly some areas where I don't have the proper syntax at my fingertips, but that's what our community is all about,
Yeah,
is
that's right.
providing opportunities for either myself or somebody else to help you get that proper syntax so that you're not hung up on those small details like case sensitive parameters or the structure of a parameter being passed as an array versus an object. Those can be sometimes frustrating, and that's what the community is all about. So.
Perfect. Well, I think that's it for today, but thank you everyone for coming to another community show, and thank you for all of the questions. Really do appreciate it. Please take time to give us some feedback at the end whenever you leave. Your feedback is a gift for us to continue these and to continue to get better. This is recorded, so that I'm going to post this out by tomorrow, and then I will email and push out all of the other the presentation and the other stuff that Dan mentioned in an email as well. But it will be posted to the community directly by tomorrow. So thank you everyone for coming. Have a great holiday. We'll talk to you in January from a show or webinar standpoint. But thanks again, Dan. This was great. And thanks
Absolutely.
everyone for coming.
Appreciate all the feedback and comments, questions.
All right. Take care, everyone. Happy holidays. Getting stuff like very detailed. Thank you. Really great session. So nice work.
Yeah.
All right, man. Take care.
Cheers.